Hey guys, this is part 2 of a 2-part series where I install Linux and Windows 3.1 on this old 386 DX40. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, you really should go back and watch that. We're going to dual boot this system using the Linux loader, that is LILO. Before we get started though, let's pop back into DOS. And we'll go into fdisk. And just as a recap, let's take a look at our existing partition table. Okay, we have an 88 meg DOS partition. It is currently set active. And of course, we're able to boot into DOS. So the goal from here is to install Linux in a separate partition and to do so without clobbering our Windows partition. So I'm booting from the Slackware 3.2 installation floppy. And as you can see, it prompted me for the root floppy as well. Let's log in as root. And we'll go into a similar fdisk program to the one that we saw in DOS. And there's our DOS partition, dev HDA1. So we need to create 2 partitions here. There's going to be a primary partition for Linux itself, and then one for the swap. So starting cylinder is 180. We have 400 megs to play with. I want to keep 32 megs for the swap. So let's make this 368 megs. That'll be plenty for our purposes. And now we'll make a third partition from cylinder 928 to the end of the drive. Let's print that partition table and double check. So HDA2 is going to be the root partition for Linux. HDA3 is going to be the swap. But you notice both of those partitions indicate a file system of Linux native. Now that's not what we want for the swap partition. We need to change that type to 82. And once again, print our partitions. That looks better. Now you'll also notice I didn't set the Linux partition active. We can only have one active partition on the drive. That's going to be our DOS partition. So we'll save that information, and then I can go into setup. Okay, we need to activate the swap partition. And we're doing a fresh install. And of course, it wants to format that root partition. Now, Linux does have the ability to read DOS partitions, so I'll give it access to my Windows partition so we can see that from within Linux. We're going to mount that on MNT Windows. And this system does not have a CD-ROM, so we're going to install from floppies. I'm just going to install the base Linux system and the networking components. The point of this video is not to do a full install of Linux, just enough to get a dual boot system. And just to make this easy, I'll tell it to install absolutely everything in that floppy set. Okay, we need to install a kernel. I'm just going to do it the easy way and use the kernel from the installation boot disk. This 386 has pretty standard hardware. No SCSI controller, no SCSI drives. so I really don't need anything special in here. Now, I would recommend making the boot disk. In this case, I'm pretty confident this will work, so I'll just skip over that. And now for the important part. We need to configure the Linux loader. This is what will allow us to boot between the two operating systems. I'm going to install LILO in the MBR of that hard drive. It's a very good idea to have a pause before you automatically boot into one of the operating systems. And now we're going to add the Linux partition, of course under the title Linux. And we'll add that DOS partition under the title Windows. Okay, let's install LILO. And LILO is installed. Specify our host name. Host name is Hannah. And some networking information. Now I do have an NE2000 clone network card in this system that is fully compatible with Linux. Yeah, so let's apply some networking settings, and we'll turn this into a networked box. And specify my name server. This is all the same information that I set up in Windows, of course. And indicate our time zone. Okay, and the installation is complete. Now before I reboot, just in case, I want to take a really quick look at the etc lilo.conf. That's the configuration file for the Linux loader. And as you can see, we've got our HDA2, that's the Linux partition, HDA1 as the Windows/DOS, and it's going to wait for a total of 30 seconds before it automatically boots into the default operating system, which in this case, I believe will be Linux. So let's reboot and see what happens. Okay, we got a LILO prompt. Well, kind of. It indicated LILO, so the Linux loader was properly installed, but it should actually give us a prompt and let us type in one of the two operating system titles. We'll have to address that in a moment or two. But we are booting into Linux. That's a good start. However, I don't think it saw that network card properly. Or to be more accurate, I don't think it initialized the card properly. Let's get logged in and we'll take a look. So log in as root. And it didn't ask me for a password. We'll have to correct that in a moment as well. Checking the ifconfig output, we only see the loopback interface. There should be an ETH0, Ethernet 0 interface. So something didn't work properly with that network card. Yeah, and there's our issue right there. The NE.O kernel module did not load properly. So let's mod probe that manually. Card is at IRQ5 and IO address 300 hex. If I mod probe it manually, it does indeed load properly. So we just need to update the etc rc.d, rc.modules, and we'll tell it to automatically load the NE module on boot. So we'll uncomment the mod probe NE line, indicate that card is at 300 hex, and save that file. And before I reboot, I'm going to set a password for the root user. Later versions of Slackware, of course, would prompt you to do that before rebooting. And while we're at it, I really should add a non-root user. Normally I would add Scott, Annika, and Philip, but in this case, we're just doing a base install, so let's just add in Scott. And specify a password, of course. And now we can do a reboot. And let's see if we have a network connection on reboot. Okay, we still have that LILO issue, of course. But this time on boot, you can see the NE2000 Ether card probe at 300 hex. So all things being equal, we should have access to the internet. Check our ifconfig output. And now we do indeed see the ETH0 with the proper IP address. And I can ping Google. Okay, so networking is indeed working. Now let's take a look at that LILO issue. There should be a prompt from LILO so we can pick which operating system we want to boot into. So we'll add the word prompt into our lilo.conf. And I'm also going to decrease the wait time. Let's make it wait 10 seconds before it automatically boots into an OS. Oh, before we reboot though, I do need to reinstall LILO in the master boot record. Do that by typing LILO. And this is a good sanity check as well. If there were any errors, any syntax errors in that lilo.conf, that would show up when we type LILO. So once again, let's reboot. And it should look a little different this time. There we go. We've got a LILO prompt. And I can pick which operating system I want to boot into. Let's go into Linux one last time. And this time when it comes up, I'm going to log in as Scott. We'll test the non-root user. And then I'll switch to root. You should really only log in as root for system configuration and maintenance. It's generally safer to log in as a non-root user and only switch to root if you really have to. And there we go, the Scott user looks good as well. Now you remember during the installation, we gave Linux access to the Windows partition. That's the HDA1 I mounted under MNT Windows. So let's take a look at our Windows partition from within Linux. I'm going to cd into MNT Windows, and you can see some familiar files in there. We've got an autoexec.bat and a config sys, among other things. And we have read-write access to that partition. So I'm going to delete a couple of files in here. And while we're at it, let's update the autoexec.bat. I want it to automatically go into Windows when we boot that partition. So let's add the word win at the end of our autoexec.bat. And save that file. And let's reboot. But this time, instead of going into Linux, when we get to a LILO prompt, I'm going to type Windows. And there we go. We're loading into DOS. It's executing the autoexec.bat. And we're in Windows. Okay, so we have successfully installed 2 operating systems on this 386DX40. We have a fully functional copy of DOS and Windows 3.11, dual booted with a copy of Slackware 3.2. This would have been a very common thing to do back in the mid to late 1990s, and for a lot of us, it served as something of a gateway drug into the Linux world. I know I dual booted between Windows and Slackware now for quite a few years before I finally took the plunge and switched over entirely to a Slackware environment. I would later do the same sort of thing between Linux and FreeBSD, and, well, I've been using FreeBSD for 10 to 12 years now. So if you enjoyed this one, please feel free to like and subscribe. Are any of you currently dual booting between various operating systems? Let me know in the comments. And beyond that, as always, thanks for watching.